Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Tonight's story, The Last One, by Eli Nixon. This story is from his book Nightmare Machines, Creepypasta, Urban Legends, and Tales of Madness. It's difficult to trace the origins of this story back to any particular location, let alone any single person, although according to Snopes.com it appears to have started as a result of chilling rumors coming out of Germany after the cessation of World War II. It appeared on the internet under various titles, typically either Letter of Intent or The Last One. In rendering the story here, I chose to go with the latter title because it holds a certain morbid appeal that coincides with the overall theme of the urban legend. The rumors were awful, unspeakable. Whispered behind closed doors and drawn windows, they spread over the city like an airborne disease. Dead, hacked apart, a blood-stained doll clutched in still fingers. How the rumors started nobody knew, but the disappearances and the newspaper headlines gave them wind and dropped them into every dark crack of post-war Berlin. And one call of warning became stitched to the inside of every wild story that fell on a horrified ear. Don't eat the meat. People became afraid to leave their homes, afraid to send their daughters to school. Night made no difference, because the abductions always happened during the day. The dismal winter sun that had been so depressing before, as it gleamed coldly onto the ruined buildings and skeletal bombed-out structures, took on a menacing light. Nothing was safe. The shadows had become the last refuge of a starving, terrified city. As the rumors gained substance, fear metamorphosed into indignant rage. Pockets of angry Berliners descended on the city's homeless, their cripples and displaced refugees. Stories of these attacks crept into the headlines alongside hearsay accounts of horror houses, mad butchers, and missing children. Targets were plentiful. A quarter of the city was living on the streets, their homes and offices demolished by the bombs. Everywhere people scratched out a living as best they could. The rat population had plummeted. For a time, bellies were full. A young German schoolgirl vanished 2 blocks from her home in broad daylight. An amputee was stabbed and set alight by an impromptu mob in the golden light of the setting sun. His body burned the whole night, and in the morning, the rats feeding on the smoking corpse were attacked by children with rocks. Again, bellies were full. But terror gleamed behind the eyes of the entire city. When the long, frozen nights began claiming victims, the streets became filled with the corporeal refuse of the dead. Then these too disappeared. Nobody stopped to question how a government as shattered as this one could maintain cleanup crews to clear the streets. Nobody saw trucks winding their way through the rubble piled high with dead bodies. But nobody talked about it. Nobody wanted to face the realization that there were no trucks. There was no organized government cleanup system. In a dark, tormented corner of everyone's minds, they knew where those bodies were going, and the whispered mantra became stronger. Don't eat the meat. The train station was crowded with bodies. Nina pushed through the bustling crowd, making her way toward the far end where she'd be able to slip over the railing and take the shortcut through the tall grass behind the crumbling barber shop. Her braided pigtails bounced as she swerved through the maze of businessmen, soldiers, and housewives, all leaving or arriving on their daily business. The smell of sweat and unwashed clothing hung heavy over the station. Spring had steadily nudged winter out of the city, but the remnants of those dark months still clung to the streets like a blood stain. It was 1946, and Berlin was still trapped in the economic shambles of the post-war environment. Pieces of the city were being stitched back to life, but slowly, too slowly. The warmth of spring had initially warmed the spirits of its residents, but soon it had also begun to warm the decaying bodies left unfound in the blackened buildings and choked alleyways. The scavengers had not been thorough enough. The entire city crouched under a fog of rot, and still the disappearances continued. The scent of roasting pork wafted through the sweating horde, and Nina's mouth began to water. She'd learned over the winter how long a body could survive without food, and although it had been nearly 2 days since she'd last eaten, and although the city officials had released dozens of statements claiming that the rumors were unfounded, the temptation wasn't quite strong enough for Nina. She'd heard the stories, seen the photos, the men crouched over formless shadows, the blood-streaked teeth glinting back at the camera. The bodies that were no longer whole. Pinching her nose shut, Nina reached to the railing and was climbing over when a hand grabbed her from behind. She jumped and nearly screamed before she realized that it was a station guard. "What are you doing, little girl?" He spoke in the militaristic German, short, formal barks, punctuated by short, severe pauses. Nina dropped her gaze from his accusing stare and mumbled a reply. "Speak up. Now tell me what you were doing on that railing." "My house. It's over there." Nina gestured across the grass causeway behind the railing. "And what has that to do with my railing, He swiped a white glove across the immaculate railing and pinched the imaginary dirt between his forefinger and thumb before flicking it away. His posture became more rigid. "You were cutting across, yes? This is a prohibited zone, little girl. You will go around to the official exit and use the streets." The guard scanned Nina's dirt-stained knees, her torn dress from last year already too small, and her smudged cheeks. "Show me your ticket." I don't have one," the guard finished for her. "I see. Then you are trespassing in my station. This is your only warning. I will not see you again, yes?" "Yes," mumbled Nina. The guard waited. "Yes, sir," repeated Nina. The guard spun on his heels and strode purposefully through the crowd, then glanced back at her and paused. Nina turned and began walking to the exit. Satisfied, the guard disappeared into the throbbing mass of people. Nina shoved past body after body and was nearly at the exit gate when a large suitcase swung around and knocked her to the ground. The man with the suitcase continued hurrying toward his train with only a brief backward glance. No one else seemed to notice the girl lying on the floor of the station, her nose bleeding from the smack to the face. Hard leather shoes stamped all around her. Nina cried out, but the roar of the steam engine drowned out the tiny sound. Then something tapped at her shoulder, and Nina braced for the weight of the foot that would crush her malnourished bones when suddenly there was a man crouched down beside her. He pulled her to her feet, and Nina saw that he was blind. A pair of dark glasses hid his eyes, and in his hand was clutched a white cane. The other hand held Nina firmly by the shoulder as she regained her balance. Nina was about to offer her thanks when she noticed the soft, mottled skin of his face. It seemed almost to slough off the bones dragged into a thick puddle around his chin and mouth by the pull of gravity. There were plenty of diseased in the city, but this man didn't seem to be starving. On the contrary, he seemed well fed, although some kind of illness was evidently pulling him apart. Swallowing in her revulsion, Nina politely thanked the man for helping her up. He smiled, and his mouth was a black hole. His teeth long ago rotted away, and his gums turned ash-gray from whatever disease he had. "It's my pleasure," he gargled, what sounded like a thick ball of phlegm rattling hideously in the back of his throat. His spindly arm still clutched the sleeve of her dress. Nina felt his soft fingers squishing against her arm, smelled his fetid, rotting breath. I was hoping you could do me a favor, he said, smiling again. Nina looked at her shoes. I need to deliver an urgent letter to a friend, but as you can see, I'm having trouble, he tapped his cane pointedly on her arm, finding my way. Well, Nina began. Like a flash, the man had an envelope in his hand, a handwritten address scrawled across the front. In another instant, he grabbed her arm and stuffed the envelope into her hand. Thank you so much. Such a sweet young girl, he grinned. It's very important, you see. Nina glanced at the address and saw that it would only take her a block away from her route. Hadn't her mother always said that they should be kind to the unfortunate, that there were so many these days? There was precious little humanity left in these parts, and that they should help. Nina smiled back at him. He was just an old blind man, after all. I would be delighted, she said. Now, I really must be going. My mother is expecting me. Yes. Thank you, my dear. See that it's done. The blind man rose to his feet and quickly hobbled away, disappearing into the crowd. For a brief instant, Nina considered dropping the envelope and running straight home, but it would do no harm to help the man. Her family would be waiting, regardless, dinner hopefully bubbling on the little wood stove. Fresh onion stew, maybe, or potato cakes. Whatever it was, it wouldn't be meat. The street outside the train station was as familiar as it was unsettling. Homeless milled aimlessly through the partially cleared rubble, searching for a place to lie down undisturbed in the waning evening hours. Street vendors cooked strips of pork on rusted fire barrels, shouting their wares to the passing men and women who looked hungrily at the food before shambling on, pockets empty. The backdrop of scorched Berlin burned in the fading sunlight, black shadows covering the stains of soot and ruin. At the right time of day, just for a second, it almost looked beautiful when the worst of the decay was hidden and the chilling black night hadn't yet cast it all into darkness. Nina noticed none of this as she hurried down the street, her head down to avoid the gaze of strangers who asked with their eyes for a bite of food, a trifling penny that might help them survive another day. She felt their haunting gazes on her back as she passed. This was just life, but it would get better, her mama said. It would get better, and soon. Already news had hit the town that relief packages would arrive soon. There would be food for everyone then, and Nina would save her bread and come back here to share it. To give her a reason not to look, she instead looked at the envelope in her hands. It was small and stained, the address scratched with a shaky hand in reddish-black ink. It must be important. Even paper was in short supply these days, as was the ink with which to write on it. As she studied it, something flitted through her mind. There was something wrong with something here. The blind man, she realized. How had he found her on the ground when no one else had noticed? With the cane, of course, she realized just as quickly. Everyone looks ahead, but the blind man feels the ground. Just luck that he'd been passing over her. Most of the street numbers were unintelligible, either covered by concrete or blown to bits completely, but Nina knew her way around this part of the city. As she turned onto the street where her destination lay, she caught a furtive movement out of the corner of her eye. A figure stepped through a doorway, something long and white tucked under his arm. Nina quickened her pace, a vague feeling of something sinister tugging at her. The smell of rot drifted to her, rather than the passing stench that comes from crossing an alley with an undiscovered corpse. This stink became stronger with every step she took. The entire street reeked, cloaked in an invisible layer of horrible decay that blanked out everything else. Nina choked back bile. Her fingers clutched the hateful envelope, crumpling it in her sweaty hand. 2 more houses, then she'd be there. She wouldn't even hand it over in person, just knock quickly and leave the envelope on the doorstep. She wanted to get out of here, needed to get out. Another step, and another putrid wave of rot rolled over her. It was suffocating. Then she was there. She stood at the bottom of the cement step for a moment and looked up at the house. It was no different than any other on the block, just bare, gray concrete, 2 stories high, a large gaping hole taken out of the east wall from one of the thousands of bombs that had rained on the city. 2 broken support beams jutted from the top of the hole, looking for all the world like jagged teeth, turning the hole into a hideously yawning mouth. It wanted her. It wouldn't let her leave. It would tear her limbs, screaming from her body. No, it was just a hole. Nina felt crushed by the weight of the rotting stench that was drifting from the house. It would consume her. No, it was just a hole. It was just a house. It was just a house. It's just a house, Nina whispered, and the sound of footsteps echoed from the street behind her. She whirled around and saw the blind man behind her, sunglasses in hand and cane held under his arm. He smiled, his eyes glinting, and something shuffled inside the house. Mind numb with terror, Nina fumbled with the envelope in her hands, tearing it open. Inside was a single slip of paper, just a wisp of parchment, with a single sentence scrawled across it. This is the last one I'm sending you today. The door creaked open. So thank you again for your indulgence in listening to this reminder that the crimes and horrors of conflict do not necessarily stop when the fighting stops. Stay scary, my wildlings, and make the most of your nights.